and by Tough Traveler, manufacturer and retailer of luggage.
That the only reason the employers were so powerful was not because they in fact had that much power in terms of dealing with the lives of their workers at will, but that what made them truly powerful was that we were weak.
And it's not just a question of wages, it's a basic question of hope for the future.
Don't you believe in democracy? Then why don't you let us have an election?
Cesar comes along and says, hey, wait a minute. This is America, everybody's equal, and we want our power.
And his way was with priests and nuns who frequently had mini skirts, and hundreds and hundreds of Ivy League students who were out here for the fun of fighting the growers.
The story of organizing farm workers started long before he was born and will go on long after his death. But during his lifetime, Cesar Chavez came to represent that struggle. He brought the farm workers' faces and stories to the American public, and in the process, helped them achieve a measure of dignity and respect. This is the story of the farm workers' movement and of the man who inspired it.
Major funding for this program was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the San Francisco Foundation, the California Wellness Foundation, the California Council for the Humanities, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the following funders.
California's great Central Valley, glimmering in gold and green. This great valley provides much of the food for the nation and great wealth for a few. For well over a century, agriculture has reigned as the largest and most powerful industry in this Golden State. But as you travel up the valley's spine, Highway 99, there is nothing which reflects a 100-year battle in these fields. No public tributes to the field workers, the Native American, the Chinese, Japanese, Mexican, Filipino, black and white, men, women, and children who built this agribusiness empire with their back-breaking labor. Hidden from view are the migrant camps, the homes and the union halls which generated long, bitter, and often bloody struggles against conditions approaching slavery. California's agricultural boom began in the 1860s with the end of the gold rush. Workers were needed to cultivate huge, undeveloped tracts. With no jobs in the mines, unemployed Chinese men provided an instant labor pool. Then the Japanese and the Filipinos arrived. They provided a skilled and stable workforce for these factories in the fields. But whenever they organized for higher wages or attempted to operate their own farms, they were met with shootings, beatings, and deportations. A new wave of Mexicans joined Mexican Americans whose ancestors had worked these lands a century before them. The newcomers provided a large, cheap labor force which could be brought in for temporary work. then returned to Mexico when they were no longer needed. From 1910 to 1930, more than 1 million people made the journey north to work and to escape the ravages of revolution and war. For most, it was a journey into a familiar homeland. A land which once had been Mexico. Once they embarked on the migrant trail, they would find that their lot would be no different than those who had come before them. Valley, near Yuma, Arizona. An arid desert that starts in the Sonora Range in Mexico and stretches northward towards Canada. It was here that Juana and Librado Chavez met and married, and it was here that their second child, Cesario Estrada Chavez, was born on March 31st, 1927.
Well, we lived in a farm. Actually, it was a homestead that my grandfather had homesteaded, and then it was handed on to my dad. And we had a lot of fun. Like during the summer, we just hike all over the place and swim in the canal all day long and fish, and so it was very nice.
Well, all that summer before school, we'd play, school. I was a teacher, of course, and they were the students. And I got Cesar ready, and I told him, when you go to school, the teacher's going to ask you, what's your name, little boy? She's going to have Cesar Chavez. How old are you? I'm 6, and, all those questions. He was ready. We went to school, and the teacher says, okay, Cesar, let's sit here. And, your sister has to go to her. He says, oh, no. He says, I'm sitting with my sister. And he took off the door, and I ran after him. Then finally he agreed he had to go with the first graders. But he won that first battle right there and then.
Juana Chavez was a gentle woman with a deep religious faith. She gave young Cesar his first lessons in nonviolence.
She didn't believe in violence. She would always say, if somebody wants to fight with you and you go ahead and fight back, that fighting will never end. So you have to be the one to stop it right then and there. Don't continue the fight.
Although the Chavez children were barely aware of it, the country was in the middle of the Great Depression. All across the country, factories were shut down and millions had lost their jobs, farms, and homes. The Chavez family still had their farm, but many others had nothing.
I even hate to think back to it. We lived on tents that didn't have a floor, just dirt, mud, I would say. And we went cold and hungry during winter because there was no work. We survived by going out on the ditch banks and picking mustard greens, and my brothers would go out getting fish from the canals.
California seemed like the promised land to thousands of small farmers and sharecroppers from Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. Driven from their farms by winds, drought, and bank foreclosures, they formed a never-ending stream of broken-down jalopies heading west.
But they go to the lettuce fields, and what do they find? Filipinos and Mexicans do the work. For the work is hard, and Filipinos and Mexicans are strong and can do it better.
In 1938, the Chavez family lost their farm. They packed everything they owned into an old Studebaker and set out for California.
It was awful. It was really bad because we had never worked for anybody else. We never lived out of our home. Here we came to California and we were lucky we got a tent, but most of the time we were living under a tree with just the canvas on top of us and sometimes in the car.
Cesar left school after the 8th grade to work with the rest of the family, following the crops north from Oxnard to San Jose. Sometimes they moved on when the job was over, and other times when his father Librado felt there was something wrong.
If he was working with somebody who was really abusing people, he'd just leave, Let's go, let's not work here. We'd pick up and leave, go look for something else. He never did take it. I think that's where Cesar probably got some of his first ideas in what he did later.
Throughout the Depression, migrant farm workers fought for decent wages and working conditions. Mexicans and Okies joined forces in the hundreds of strikes that exploded, sometimes spontaneously, during the 1930s.
We were out picking cotton when we saw all these cars and trucks just honking and calling strike, strike. So we walked out and we just followed the caravan. I didn't know anything about a strike.
I can remember the biggest impression I had from those days of watching those white people coming in from Oklahoma and Arkansas and Texas, the people whom John Steinbeck called the Okies and the Arkies, coming in with all of their ingrown prejudices and hatred, and learning in the course of these strikes and the struggles that they had more in common with that worker with the brown skin and the black skin than they had with the vigilantes with the white skin who were beating everybody up.
And I recall strikes in an effort to organize, where they invoked the criminal syndicalism laws, which was a threat, and more than a threat, it became a very powerful tool in the hands of growers, because actually men or women who tried to organize farm workers could be sent to jail.
I never made any secret of the fact that I was a communist. As a matter of fact, it was the first thing that I would announce when I'd come to an organizing meeting. All they wanted to know was, could you help us organize? Could you help us gain a living wage? Could you help us gain decent working conditions?
From then on, the charge of communist involvement would be used to discredit workers' efforts. President Roosevelt had pledged to end the Depression and put America back to work. But in 1936, millions were still suffering.
I see millions denied education and the opportunity to better the lot of themselves and their children. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished.
Strike hysteria flares in California. Disorder, swift and violent, attends an attempt to keep guards from entering a cannery plant, trying to reopen.
Congress tried to calm things down with the National Labor Relations Act, giving workers the right to join unions and bargain with their employers. But the law excluded farm workers. They kept on trying to organize, and they kept on losing.
Crooks taking lettuce to market can get through only under guard. Scores have been injured in the fighting.
The forces of freedom are on the offensive around the world.
In 1941, the United States entered the war against Japan and Germany. New war industries drew the Okies from the fields to the factories with the promise of decent wages. Other workers were needed to fill the gap, so Mexicans were brought to the United States under government contract.
our good neighbors from south of the border lend willing hands. Thousands of them come north to help allies in the battle for food.
They were called braceros. Kept in guarded, isolated camps, they had no say in who they worked for or how much they were paid for their labor. Their wages helped keep domestic wages low, and their presence made it nearly impossible for field workers to organize unions.
They would tell us they were ill, their stomach was upset or something, and yet they still had to go work, because if they complained, they said, okay, you go to work or you go back to Mexico. The labor contractor would tell them this.
During the war years, the Chavez family moved to Delano, where Cesar met a quiet young girl named Helen Favela.
We were pachucos. We did a lot of dancing. She loved to dance. It was the time of the jitterbug and the boogie-woogie and those kinds of dances. She was very good at it.
Cesar and Helen's romance was put on hold when he joined the Navy in 1946, an experience he later described as the worst 2 years of his life. When he got out of the service in 1948, they married, moved to San Jose, and began a family. For the next 3 years, Cesar worked in a lumber yard and in the fields. A local priest, Father Donald McDonald, introduced him to the teachings of the Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi. These ideas on nonviolence echoed those he'd learned from his mother. But Cesar had much more to learn before he could put these ideas into practice. And there was still the problem of the braceros in the fields.
We were 6 brothers in the service, and we got out at the discharge the draftees. Then, when we went back to the Sam Hamburg ranch where we worked, he wanted to pay us less than he was paying the braceros, which we trained to work in the fields and doing the tractor work and all that.
In the summer of 1952, a man named Fred Ross arrived in the San Jose barrio called Sal Si Puedes, get out if you can. Back in the 30s, Ross had run the government camp for migrants that John Steinbeck immortalized in his novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Now he was in San Jose to start a chapter of a grassroots group, the Community Service Organization. Father McDonald suggested that he talk to a young man named Cesar Chavez.
And somehow Cesar heard he was coming and thought it was going to be another, anthropologist from Stanford or San Jose State coming down to ask Mexicans why they had so many babies and ate tortillas and beans. And he wanted to have nothing to do with another study. So he told Helen to tell this guy, Ross, that he wasn't home.
And finally, about the third time, we said, let's talk to him. So he wants. He's very insisting. He wants to talk to us. So let's see what he wants to sell us. That's what we had.
So when my dad began to paint the picture of how you build power, Cesar told me and many others later that a light went off in his mind. Wow, it's so simple. You could really bring about significant change by organizing.
Well, it was a time when raising your voice about problems that existed in your community made you a communist because it was during the McCarthy era. And in spite of that, the folks in our barrio and in other barrios in Bakersfield and all across the state of California decided to band together and try and take on some very critical issues in our community, like police brutality and discrimination in hiring, voter registration.
A few months after I joined the group, I was offered a job to become a full-time organizer. And I was very frightened because I didn't know if I could do the job. I came home, I told my wife that I had been approached and they were going to give me $30 a week.
It was funny because the only way I would remember Fred is that here comes that tall man to come and take my dad away again. It was like every time he came, my dad would leave, and of course they traveled together and organized together.
It was this community organizing experience that Cesar would use later to build a union. In 1956, he recruited Gilbert Padilla, a community activist from Fresno. In Stockton, Fred Ross met a young teacher named Dolores Huerta. Huerta had been raised by a strong-willed, single mother.
So she was seen as a leader, and she always pushed me into doing things, you know. And, I mean, she always had me doing something, and unfortunately, I didn't get the other gifts that she had, which were her homemaking skills, right? Because she always had me out there doing things. So to me, it was a very natural role.
Everyone who worked in CSO had to juggle work and family responsibilities.
One evening, we had to talk strategy, and we were going to go to a meeting. And Cesar, I asked him, as usual, how's Helen and the kids? And he was telling me about one of his daughters who was going to have surgery. I said, when? He said, well, tonight. I said, Cesar, I said, don't you think you should be there? And he said, well, we really have to do this. I said, but Cesar, don't you think this is more important? He said, it is more important, but on the other hand, I've got to do this.
With the broadcast of the classic CBS documentary, Harvest of Shame, in 1961, Edward R. Murrow put farm workers back in the national spotlight for the first time since the publication of The Grapes of Wrath.
We present this report on Thanksgiving because were it not for the labor of the people you are going to meet, you might not starve, but your table would not be laden with the luxuries that we have all come to regard as essentials.
By now, Chavez had risen to become the national director of CSO. He had always pushed CSO to organize farm workers, but when the leadership said he couldn't, he resigned in 1962. Dolores Huerta and Gilbert Padilla joined him to start a union for farm workers.
Adiós, amor. Adiós, amor. No te dejaré, no te dejaré.
The decision to quit CSO was a hard one. It meant leaving a steady paycheck and uprooting a family from their home in Los Angeles.
In fact, when he decided that he wanted to go organize farm workers, he asked her what area would she like to go to, because he knew it was going to be hard on her. And she chose Delano because she had family there. She had 2 sisters, and she had 2 brothers who lived nearby, and she figured that if we needed help, that she'd have her family nearby.
I would have to say that my mother was really the bedrock of the union, and of course our family in the early years, and even now. You know, my father was gone, he was gone a lot, and so my mother basically raised 8 of us.
It wasn't hard doing the field work because I had done that most of my life, and I wasn't afraid to take on the responsibility of raising the family. It's just that for me it was hard because they were small, and it scared me, you know, leaving them alone so that I could go out and bring the bread home while Cesar was gone most of the time.
In Stockton, Dolores Huerta also began to organize field workers.
I knew what it was like to send my kids to school with you know, shoes that had holes in the rain. So it was a very, very hard time for us. But again, this is what farm worker families go through every day of their lives, you know.
Among all the work that I did out in the fields, the short handle hoe was the worst. Even right now, I can't sit up straight. I have to sit leaning to one side or at a certain angle so that my back can rest. because the short handle is very bad.
When you wanted to go to the bathroom, there weren't any bathrooms, and so you felt very embarrassed. Held it as long as you could, and then you went and you were embarrassed.
Francamente, siempre los supervisores decían, ándenle, van muy atrás, han hecho muy poco. Ya van más los filipinos que ustedes, mexicanos, aquí. Hagan la lucha. Nos ponían presión uno al otro. Iban con la otra cuadrilla, decían, pues los mexicanos llevan mucho, ustedes no han hecho nada. Apúrenle. Y iban con los negros también, pues igual. Así es que era lo más a tiro y jala. Engañando para apuchar a la gente.
And what had happened in the past, of course, was that there were always strikes in the fields, and the workers would strike, and especially when outside organizers came in, and then they would leave, and the workers then would get blacklisted, and they would be left worse off than what they were before. So, we didn't go into the organizing with the intention of trying to build a union through strikes, because we already knew that had failed.
Pero de cada 100 hombres, de cada 200 hombres en que hablaba, uno u otro decían, ya es tiempo. Y luego decían, seguro que sí, o decían estos, bueno, ustedes ya saben, ya estamos hartos. Y déjenme decirles que no son los hombres los más valientes. Hubo más mujeres que hombres que decían, ya es tiempo que peleemos.
What we would do is we would go and leaflet, in all the neighborhoods, I would take my kids to leaflet, and Cesar was doing the same thing with his kids. These were our crews, the children, they were the ones that were doing the leafleting door to door.
And he would make a day of it. He would take us at the end of the day and get us an ice cream and make sure, that it was enjoyable, not just the work, but that, we got some fun out of it.
A Protestant group called the Migrant Ministry had worked with farm workers since the 1920s.
And then every year they saw, year after year after year, that nothing ever changed. No matter how much they tried, no matter what they did, nothing ever changed. It was like the same thing. So then, in the midst of this reality, Cesar and the National Farm Workers Association comes along to organize farm workers so that they can change the situation themselves.
We had to have, other than the union, we had to have like the service center, and a credit union would be nice, and he came up with the idea of credit union. And the thing about Cesar, that once he got an idea in his head, he wouldn't drop it. He would never drop it. He would just keep it, just keep it.
The fledgling organization had no money, but Cesar had an idea.
I had built me a modest little house, a little one-bedroom. I only had 2 kids, and it was a nice little house, but it was a small house. And one day he came up to me and says, Richard, how much do you think your house is worth? I said, I don't know. Cesar, I said, probably $2,500, $3,000 at the most. He said, why don't we go to the bank and find out? So we went, Bank of America, I think it was, and they came and looked at the house. He says, yeah, we can lend you $3,700. It was already paid for it. He says, we can lend you $3,700. And boy, before you know it, my house was in hock, and we got $3,700 to start a credit union.
The movement needed a symbol. The eagle was designed as a shape that anyone could draw, and red and black are the traditional strike colors in Mexico. Soon the eagle became a symbol of pride for hundreds of farm workers. Congress finally ended the Bracero program in 1964, opening the door for organizing farm workers. At the same time, another more traditional union was beginning to take hold in the fields. A Filipino named Larry Itliong led the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee in Delano. In 1965, when Coachella growers cut wages during the harvest, the Filipinos struck and won. As the harvest moved north to Delano, there were rumblings that the Filipinos would strike again.
They said, we'll go on strike. So we told them, you suffer a lot of hardship. Maybe you get hungry, maybe you're going to lose your car, maybe you're going to lose your house. So they said they don't care. They feel that they're not being treated fairly by their employers, so they took a strike vote.
But none of the Filipinos who voted to strike wanted to man the picket lines.
Well, they said they want to picket our boss. We've been working for him for 10, 15, 30 years. We get mad at us. So I said, well, forget about the strike. A couple of days later, they come back again. So they said that they will picket.
Kung ang ating kalagayan ay magbabuti, yan ang isipin ninyo. Ginagala kong malabis na pakinggan.
September 8, 1965. That is when about 1,500 Filipinos went on strike against the grape growers in Delano. At noon hour, there are a lot of picked grapes under the vines. And that is when we quit and went home.
First, we had our own meeting, to decide whether we would strike or not. And I always remember Helen. I always tell a story about Helen because when we got to Helen, of course, Cesar was worried about what she would think because of all the kids. And when he got to Helen, she said, well, what are we? Aren't we a union?
Para mantenernos. ¿Qué pasa con ustedes? Estos patrones no los necesitan a ustedes como nosotros los necesitamos ahorita. Don't believe the propaganda of the short show. We want you to know that our struggle is not with you. Our struggle is with power. Don't support.
And so, without planning, preparation, or money, the Delano grape strike, La Huelga, had begun.
All of us are looking for a place under the sun. By that I mean for a union that we can belong as farm workers, which is going to be built by farm workers, and it's going to be for farm workers.
Este es un camino muy largo que tenemos que andar. Unos dijo vamos a servir de puentes. Otros de postes. Otros de carreteras, porque es un camino muy largo, dice, y que todos van a pasar sobre nosotros.
There are Mexicans, there are whites, and there are blacks, and if you don't involve all the others to be with you, you are sunk. You fail, because those nationalities that are not involved become your scabs, and they break your strike.
But it became like a brotherhood, all right? I think for the first time in the history of this country, let's take the Filipino workers and the Mexican workers, which was always being segregated, the Filipinos in their own camp, the Mexicans in their own camp. The strike brought us together. We had the Filipino hall open for the strikers, and we ate Filipino food and Mexican food.
I heard a mellow voice saying, "Hello, brother." I stopped, looked back, and then walked back to shake hand with this Mexican who was talking to a Filipino and said, "Cesar Chavez." And I introduced myself, P. Velasco. Glad to meet you. That is how we met. Ever since that time, we have been calling each other brothers up to the end.
Dahil sa iyo, dahil sa iyo, nais
Once the Delano strike started, everything was extremely intense because you had picketing that started every morning, like at 4 o'clock in the morning, that went on all day. We couldn't take any time off at all because things were happening like every moment.
At first, it was very hard to organize those that believed that women should stay home and do the washing and the cooking. But they never stopped to think about them working out in the fields. So why shouldn't they attend meetings and be involved with the union? It got to a point to where most of us out in the picket lines were women.
We're paying all we can afford. What else? What else do you want?
You really say that true about?
That's right. That's right. In fact, right from the way the grapes sold last year, we're paying more than we can afford.
And every labor union guy knows that when we're talking about recognition, you're really talking about the guts of the union. We're not striking for a wage increase or for a pension fund. We're striking for the very elemental things of labor.
I think the growers and those people that hire workers are opposed to a union because, especially the farm worker union, because it's Mexicans. And I've seen so much racism out here that if he had been an Anglo leader, we would have gotten everything.
The Delano growers were also immigrants. Italians, Slavs, Armenians, whose families had arrived at the turn of the century. Some ran small farms. Others controlled empires with thousands of acres.
Part of it had to do, I think, with race. Part of it, I think, had to do with the fact that we were messing with their land. And part of it had to do with the fact that you had self-made, self-reliant people who built things on their own. And they were damned if anybody, no matter what race, is going to tell them how to run their lives.
Well, when I first met them and saw their situation, I said to myself, I really doubt they're going to ever make it because they don't have the resources that the growers have. The growers have associations, they have law firms, they have, you name it, they've got enormous amount of political power, especially in the San Joaquin Valley. And here, this poor little group really has nothing.
We wish to welcome you to Delano.
What the farm workers did have was the ability to attract supporters. New faces started appearing. Students, activists, religious people, and supporters from other unions.
Things that will keep us alive for the next few months.
We accepted everybody.
I thank you again.
We just took them in. And we took a lot of people. We worked with no money. We were sick, dedicated people. Like, everybody, you're crazy working for $5 a week and room and board. And that's what we were not interested in making money. We were interested in changing things and changing things.
The person I'm going to introduce to you is our beloved director, Cesar Chavez.
He didn't judge. He didn't say, oh, you're a girl or you're a woman and therefore you can't do this. He didn't say, you don't have formal education, therefore you can't do that. His approach was, if you're willing to do the job, you got it. If you're willing to take the responsibility, you got it.
Why are you here today?
Because I don't like the people that are here in our town. They don't belong here, and I wish they'd all go back to where they came from.
Which people are these you're talking about?
I'm talking about the outsiders that have come into this strike and have interfered with our daily workers.
Are you unhappy at the labor troubles?
We had no labor troubles.
And some of us talked about how the experience of working in the civil rights movement gave us what we call Mississippi eyes, because you would go back to where you came from, and suddenly it would look different. It had been changed. It hadn't changed, but you changed. When I went back to to Bakersfield, it looked very different. And it looked a lot more like Mississippi.
As soon as we were visible, supporting the strikers in Delano, then we were like persona non grata in almost every church, everywhere. So the reaction, I mean, Cesar used to say, Chris, you know, when we would go to meetings together, he says they're madder at you than they are at me. And the reason was we were seen as like turncoats.
It was awful. It was a terrible, terribly difficult situation because virtually all of the growers and all of the farm workers were Catholics. So what happened almost overnight was both sides said, well, since we're Catholics, the church must be on our side. Well, the problem was we had both sides saying the same thing.
So all these struggles were going on within each person and each family as to whether to join with and stay loyal to this union movement. And the church's involvement, as visible as it was, I'm sure helped farm workers who were very religious in a traditional Catholic way feel that this is the right thing to do. This is like our choice has been supported and confirmed by this institution that we believe in.
In the cities, there was a sense of frustration that unless you rioted, in the case of Watts or Rochester, that you really didn't get any attention. And there was always this tension between a movement that was headed toward violence and a movement that was going to be nonviolent.
Cesar followed the path of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. He was convinced that nonviolence had to be the guiding principle of the farm workers' movement.
Los rancheros y los contratistas y nos tenían como esclavos y teníamos que hacer la lucha de organizarnos, pero no con violencia, porque él decía, yo no quiero violencia en mi movimiento. Todo el que esté en mi movimiento no tiene que usar la violencia.
The nonviolent issue was a very, very, very difficult one when we start talking about nonviolence and the reason for nonviolence. And I think we had to convince and explain to the workers that when you get into a violent situation, in strike situations, that we were the losers.
The power of nonviolence really rests on the reservoir that you have to create in yourself of patience, not of being patient with the problems, but being patient with yourself to do the hard work.
So Cesar, I think, within our own community, presented a voice of reason and consciousness that said, look, I'm not saying don't be militant. I'm not saying don't be proactive. All I'm saying, let's not kill ourselves in the process of doing this. They may kill us, but let's not try to match the opposition with guns.
He would love to sing. He'd love to sit around singing corridos. And he used to smoke like a fiend, frankly, early on. Lots of cigarettes. He drank too many Diet Cokes or Cokes. But all of that began to fall away. All of that as time went by, as he changed, as the movement changed him, and as he changed the movement.
Cesar's nonviolence and voluntary poverty appealed to church groups around the country. Unions were attracted by the farm workers' militants. It reminded many in the labor movement of their own past struggles.
I am sure that there were no more amateurish amateurs than those auto workers in Flint and the steel workers in Gary and Youngstown who back in the mid-30s decided that the time had come to have a union. I have a good friend who says that one of the benefits of the amateur organizer is that he doesn't know all the reasons why it can't be done.
My union, the UAW, and the Industrial Union Department, of which I'm also president, we have pledged $5,000 a month to these workers for as long as it takes to win their strike.
Cesar and Larry asked us to go out and visit one of the warehouses in the city of Delano to see the picketing operation. And as we got there, the police began buzzing around us, motorcycles, cars, and so forth. And Chavez sort of chuckled. He said, well, they passed a rule yesterday that we can't march or do anything, make any demonstration in the city of Delano. And so Walter said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, well,
we can't picket here because if we do, we'll go to jail. And he said, fine, let's go to jail together. He picked up a picket sign, and the chief of police came up, ready to make the arrest. And when he got to Walter and he asked his name, and Walter said, my name's Walter Ruther, he did a double take and he said, well, I don't think I could arrest you. And so that day was the beginning.
Larry, what about the witness? Pedro, they need witnesses.
The harvest was over and fall had turned to winter. It was the 20th week of the Grape Strike.
It was cold and desolate, and the spirit of the strikers visibly sagged.
I am just a working man. You're earning more money today because the workers here were not on strike on September the 9th, and they are still on strike. Does it make you feel that you know that you are taking your brother's job?
And so it was really necessary to pump up the spirits by having a lot of songs, and sometimes just to keep the energy going, and sometimes just to be heard. The Teatro Campesino started right on the picket line in the heat of the moment, right?
We still claim that there are reds and agitators. Hold on. Among you Mexicans.
And we had the songs, and we had the actos, which we performed on top of flatbed trucks and on top of panel trucks in order to be seen.
No, senor, please, No, espérate, let's talk English, Por favor. No, we're in America, let's talk English,
The point is to take the rancher and to put him on the stage.
Well, hello, boy.
Put him up on the stage so that other people can see what he's like. Only we'll do the acting.
Look, I love you all Mexican people. I love you. I know what's good for you. I know what's good for all of you people. That's why I want to tell you right now that there is no strike.
They were the theater. I mean, they were the audience and they were the actors. There was no distinction. I didn't want a distinction. And it turns out the use of theater in this very direct way was an educational device that would prove to be very useful. And I essentially started to improvise with the workers. I asked them to do what they did on the picket line. And they could do that, as long as someone could do the scab. No one wanted to do the scab, okay? So we got a couple of people that were inclined to be clowns to get out and do the scabs, and they were, shouting epithets and stuff.
Sometimes I sit up in that office and I say to myself, I wish I was a Mexican. Oh, really, Patron? Yeah. Really, Patron? You want to be Mexican?
The teatro performed at weekly strike meetings and spread the farm workers' message in the cities. In the process, it was helping define Chicano culture.
The huelga was also a vehicle for visual artists to channel their art, and for poets to begin to write poetry, and for musicians to begin to write songs. And so it was the spark, really, that was needed, because the urge to create, to express, had been there for some time. It was just waiting for the huelga to come along to set it off.
The Delano strike was beginning to attract national attention. A Senate subcommittee arrived in Delano to investigate farm labor conditions.
This is the first time that I know of that a Senate or a congressional committee has come to an area where the farm workers are on strike. So I think it's very significant. The workers themselves feel that there is at least some recognition of the problem.
How are you? Here from about Watershard?
One of the senators was Robert Kennedy.
Well, if I have reason to believe that there's going to be a riot
started and somebody tells me that there's going to be trouble if you don't stop them, then it's my duty to stop them.
Well, then you go out and arrest them?
Well, absolutely.
Who told you that they're going to riot?
The men right out in the field that they were talking to said, if you don't get them out of here, we're going to cut their hearts out. So rather than let them get cut, you remove the cause.
I mean, this is the most interesting concept, I think, that you suddenly hear or talk about the fact that somebody makes a report about somebody's going to get out of order, perhaps violate the law, and you go in and arrest them. They haven't done anything wrong. How can you go arrest somebody if they haven't violated the law?
They're ready to violate the law. In other words, just like these labor people out here, they ask their attorney, what shall we do?
Could I suggest in the interim period of time, in the luncheon period of time, that the sheriff and the district attorney read the Constitution of the United States?
Well, after that, he went to the Filipino Hall, and I heard him say, I support your strike against the grape growers. I support your boycott. And went out and marched on the DeGiorgio picket line. And I had never seen any Democrat, much less Republican, politician do that.
I think that they were kindred spirits before they met. They both recognized in the other the same values and the same hope for the country and hope for the people who were having a tough time.
The day after the Senate hearings ended, a small band of strikers set out on a pilgrimage to the state capitol in Sacramento. Leading the procession, the banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, followed by the American flag and the farm worker eagle. The march was designed to publicize the strike and the farm workers' boycott of the liquor giant, the Schenley Corporation.
This march, although it started out in support of farm workers, became a march of the entire Spanish-speaking people of the state confronting the government.
What are your personal reasons for participating in this march?
Well, number one is that I'm a Negro and I'm from down south, and I consider the Mexican-American cause and the Negro cause very much of the same source, because there are discriminatorial factors going on in America which include both races.
The march had started with 67 strikers. By the time they arrived in Sacramento on Easter Sunday, the crowd had grown to 10,000, and the farm workers had signed their first contract with the Schenley Corporation.
The governor and the legislature of California, we say you cannot close your eyes and your ears to us any longer. You cannot pretend that we do not exist. You cannot plead ignorance to our problems, because we are here and we embody our needs for you. And we are not alone. We are accompanied by many friends.
By the summer of 1966, the Mexican and Filipino groups had merged to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee led by Chavez. By August, Ufwak had another victory, winning an election against the Teamsters at the DeGiorgio Ranch.
No, cuando ganamos, claro, todos salimos corriendo así, bailando y gritando. Sí. Y el otro partido se fue muy escurridito para otro lado, se fue muy silencito ya. Bueno, pues ni hablar. Ganamos y fue todo.
Muy contentos.
Bendito sea Dios, sí.
The first victories were sweet, but they had taken their toll on the Chavez family.
But for us, growing up there and having to go to school with the growers' kids and the labor contractors' children was difficult. I had one of the growers' kids, in fact, his name was Zanenovich, in one of my classes, and then one of the kids said, well, you know, that's Cesar Chavez's daughter. And he made a remark like, oh, yeah, Cesar Chavez's daughter. If you were Cesar Chavez's daughter, you wouldn't be here. All his kids go to private schools in Switzerland.
And I remember coming across a book with an entry. And I'm trying to remember, it was in 1967, like in February, maybe the early part of March. And I remember looking at it, and I remember there was an entry where my father said, it's very tough. I don't know if I can continue. That was it. And then, you know, I turned the pages, and I saw a couple days later another real simple entry. I spoke to Helen. I'm ready to go. That's the kind of strength that my mother gave my father.
And there was going to be a lot of sacrifice on my part and his, and I agreed fully. I knew what I was getting into. I didn't mind it. I knew I had to do it. I didn't mind it because I knew that something good was going to come of this.
The picket lines continued. This time they confronted Jimara Farms, the largest Delano grower.
You know, we sort of stumbled into the grape boycott. I mean, if people want to go back and figure out the history of this, we started boycotting the Jimara label, which is the ARA label. And the Delano growers came to their brother's aid by trading labels with Jimara. And our only response was, well, if all your labels are going to be down there, what the hell? We'll boycott all table grapes.
The grower's strategy obviously is isolate these strikers in this local setting and then bring all of our resources to bear and crush them, right? And of course, Cesar's strategy was to make this event visible way beyond Delano.
Grape strikers and their families spread out to every major city in the country. Most had never been out of the small farm towns of California's Central Valley, and no one knew what to expect.
Cesar, I said, and he looked at me and he said, like, you know, is something wrong? I said, no, I want to ask you, how do you do a boycott? He says, I don't know. He said, you're going to go out and you're going to find out how to do it. I said, oh, gee, thanks a lot.
Safeway is directly linked to the agricultural industry and to the large agricultural corporations.
I really think of the boycott as a tapestry. And so to do a small thing that could help a large number of people make a difference in their lives, I think was one thread. And Cesar used to tell us that. People do not join a cause only for an ideal. They join a cause because there is a human relationship that's involved.
I think part of me thought, yes, we're going to win because here we are and we can't go home until we do win, right? Another part of me thought, oh my goodness, how are we going to do this?
While thousands of young Americans took to the streets to protest the Vietnam War, many also joined farm worker picket lines in front of supermarkets, and the public responded.
I really resented an attitude that I observed amongst many people who were not supporting the boycott, certainly not all of them, but many, that, oh, well, these are Mexicans, they are used to stoop labor, they are used to poverty, they are fortunate they are working in this country, not fully seeing the need for their support. These people were helping to put food on our tables, a basic need of life. I didn't feel people should suffer needlessly or live in often horrendous situations, conditions, in order to feed us grapes.
At the point when we left for the boycott in Toronto, I didn't know it was in another country. I didn't know it was 3,000 miles away. I was 21 years old when I went on the boycott, and I would, in fact, cry myself to sleep at night because I missed my family. I wanted to be there to do the boycott, but I really missed my family.
At night, Cesar would be so exhausted from, the constant interviews and the efforts of the trip that if we would be staying outside of the bus, in someone's home or whatever, he had brought with him a whole suitcase full of books about Gandhi. But he was too tired to read because he read slowly. And at night, I would read to him from these books of Gandhi. And it was a time of real conversation, both between us and in terms of my own learning about what was the spiritual base of Cesar's activism.
The grape strike was now in its third year. In Delano, there was growing pressure from union members to abandon nonviolence. Cesar announced that he would fast to refocus the movement.
Jesus began his public ministry with a 40-day fast. Fasting was something very important in the whole Christian history, and it still is. And of course, Cesar saw it from two perspectives, his own Christian perspective, as well as the nonviolence of Gandhi in the Indian perspective, in which Gandhi himself had many fasts for nonviolence.
En la Biblia dice que cuando hay una cosa difícil, con oración y ayuno, Dios lo oye a uno. Allí dice en la Biblia, y yo creo que César se basaba a eso, porque sí estaba muy trabajoso, y él se puso en ayuno para convencer y para probar el sacrificio de los campesinos. Y sí, Dios lo oyó.
I knew ahead of time that he was planning a fast because he told me that he was practicing fasting, and he would practice for 2 or 3 days at a time, and found it extremely painful and difficult, and told me that he didn't think that he could actually do it, or wasn't sure he could do it.
As word of Cesar's fast spread, thousands of farm workers gathered at the union headquarters in Delano to be with him every night as he attended Mass.
Madre mía, oh consuelo del mortal, amparadme.
2 weeks into the fast, Chavez was called into court to answer charges brought by the Jumara Corporation that farm workers were using violence on the picket lines.
Kern County Courthouse to me was enemy territory before that day. And I got up early that morning because here was a guy on the 13th day of his fast and they might throw him in jail. And I frankly was pretty scared. And I went out to the 40 acres and I could see out of the fog the lights of farm worker cars, just hundreds of cars. And there were about 3,000 farm workers down in that courthouse. And that courthouse became our turf from that day on. And Jamara's lawyer, Quinlan, wanted the farm workers removed from the courthouse. And I'll never forget it because the presiding judge was a guy named Osborne. And he said, well, if I kick these farm workers out of this courthouse, it'll be another example of goddamn gringo justice.
shouldn't be cold water. It should just be warm.
What did you give him to drink from the thermos?
Just water. He's had nothing but water for, this is the 13th day.
Why is he fasting? Does it have to do with this contempt of court case?
Because the actions of this corporation have been so provocative and so vicious that it is not difficult for a person to anticipate that someplace along the line some of the members might want to retaliate, and he doesn't want that to ever happen.
Cesar had more organizing going on while he was immobilized, if you will, at the 40 Acres fasting than had ever happened before in the Union or has happened since. Thousands of people came constantly. It was a constant stream of people to pledge themselves, to commit themselves.
On the 25th day, Cesar ended his fast. Robert Kennedy returned to Delano to join him.
The very first moment when they met, Bobby said, well, how goes the boycott, Cesar? And Cesar smiled and said, how goes running for president, Bob? And so they both laughed and embraced. He just, felt he'd met one of the great men of our times. And I think he felt a really deep closeness to him. They shared the same values.
We will now begin the Mass in a spirit of penance, asking pardon from God. We ask you to look with favor upon our cause.
And make no mistake about it, decency is at the heart of the matter. For poverty is indecent. Illiteracy is indecent. The death or maiming of a brave young man in the swamps of Asia or South Vietnam, that is indecent. But what I do say is that we can do much, much better than we've done in the past, and if I'm elected President of the United States, we'll do it. Thank you very much.
We all wanted to see Bobby win, so it was we went to Los Angeles, to East LA, we did East Los Angeles and South Central LA, and even in the black community.
Chavez and the Farm Workers Union organized over 200,000 new voters in California that year, and that gave Kennedy the victory. And it proved not only the political skills of Chavez, but also of Robert Kennedy. And so we tried to find Chavez that night because as the victory began developing, he wanted Chavez with him on the platform to thank him and the rest of us for what we did in the campaign.
I want to thank Cesar Chavez, who was here a little earlier. And Bert Corona, who also worked with him, and all of those Mexican Americans who were such supporters of mine. And Dolores Huerta, who is an old friend of mine and has worked with the union, to thank her and tell her how much I appreciate her coming tonight. We have certain obligations.
But Cesar was not there because he had gone back to get Helen. And so I went up to the room to walk down with Bobby and Ethel. And the first thing that struck me is that he had no security.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you.
As we started to come back, he was supposed to go to a room with us where we had mariachis. waiting for him. That was, immediately after his speech. But then someone came and said, "No, Senator, go through here." And they took us back to the kitchen.
Senator, this way. This way. No, this way. And no, Rosie. No.
By now, Ronald Reagan had been governor of California for 2 years. He had been elected with strong support from agriculture.
What view is of the strike or boycott in the grape industry?
Oh, the grape boycott. Well, I've classified that in the past, in a number of public occasions, as immoral, and I think it is.
Governor Reagan has a fantastic mind, to clutter up the facts. They've let this thing go for almost 4 years, to a point where the whole industry is in trouble.
No one's been able to find anyone picketing the vineyards who ever worked in them. And the only contracts that were signed between Mr. Chavez Union and a few wineries that signed up under the coercion of his threats of boycott. So there is no strike, and the grape boycott is a failure.
By 1969, Chavez and the grape boycott were national news. And the boycott had become an international affair. Now growers were feeling pressure from abroad as well as at home.
John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, and Woody put it into a song. John Ford and Zanuck made a movie.
They couldn't even give the grape away. People were not only not buying, they would give you a pound of grapes. You bought $10 worth of groceries, 15, something like that. People would refuse to take the grapes. And so they knew that they had really lost it. I mean, they knew that they couldn't, they would have to come to terms with the union if they wanted to continue the grape industry.
The solid front of the grape growers finally cracked in April 1970 when Coachella grower Lionel Steinberg signed with the Farm Workers Union.
The immediate response from the other growers was dismay, and they were chagrined and concerned that perhaps the union was going to take over. But to my pleasant surprise, and it was very unexpected, we found that 6 or 8 of the major chain stores and produce houses in Canada began calling us wanting our grapes and our brand because we had the union bug.
After Steinberg signed, a few other Coachella growers followed suit. But no one knew what the Delano growers would do.
And then I realized that something important was going on, that this was the biggest grape grower in the state, 12,000 acres of grapes, and they wanted to meet, and I was really excited. I didn't want Johnny Jr. knowing it, and they wanted to meet that night. He called about 9, he called back about 10. Cesar was on the road. I left a message for Cesar, and we met in room 44 of the Stardust Motel. John Jamar Jr. and John Sr., and basically the position that Cesar and I took at that meeting was that we wanted them to round up all the Delano growers. And when we were spinning out the discussions, we told them that we wanted them to come to the 40 acres and sign the contract. And to their credit, some of them decided, well, if they're going to have to sign these contracts, they might as well be in a cooperative, celebratory mood about it.
Thank you very much. We started negotiations about 2 weeks ago, and we were very surprised when the growers came in to see that they did not have horns. And I think that they were equally surprised to see that we did not have tails.
If it works well here, if this experiment in social justice, as they've called it, or this revolution in agriculture, however you want to characterize it, if it works here, it can work elsewhere. But if it doesn't work here, it won't work anywhere.
How long has it been since you've had a grape to eat?
Oh, about a year, maybe 2 years. I don't know.
Do they taste about the way you remember?
You forget what they taste like.
The 5-year battle was finally over. The grape contracts brought decent wages, benefits, and a hiring hall, and little things that meant so much, like cool water and toilets in the fields. But there had been a price for all of this. Many workers had lost their homes, and families had broken up. Cesar's health had deteriorated. He spent a year in bed recovering from his fast. While he recuperated, he decided that the union staff also needed to get away from the pressure cooker atmosphere of Delano to somewhere quiet. The union bought a deserted tuberculosis sanatorium high in the Tehachapi Mountains, 50 miles from Delano. Helen Chavez had been a patient there as a child. Cesar named it Nuestra Señora de la Paz, Our Lady of Peace.
His faith was rooted in his religion. He also knew that, you got to do a lot of hard work, and there's a lot of practical things that have to be done. He's had this one little saying, I think that kind of encompasses those two aspects of him. He used to say, yeah, we're going to pray a little and we're going to work a lot. I know that it was a place that he could be with himself, and he could re-energize his spirit, recharge himself for the next fight.
The next fight had started long before the union moved to La Paz. The day after the grape contracts were signed, the Salinas lettuce and vegetable growers went into action.
The Salinas growers saw what was happening in the grape boycott. They had been dealing in their sheds and packing houses with the Teamsters Union, and they thought if they could sign a contract with the Teamsters Union, it would forestall Cesar trying to come in and taking over that industry.
In Salinas, the Teamsters were dealing with a different kind of worker.
These vegetable workers were working on a highly perishable crop. They'd had a history of wildcat strikes. They worked in trios more closely. They divided the money among the crew, and they were very tough.
A lot of them were ex-braceros. A lot of them had been braceros and had no illusions about, someday I'm going to become a grower.
The farm workers in Salinas were already organized before we got there. They had been quietly and patiently organizing for several years. They've been waiting for the grape strike to get over because they wanted a union too.
Yo oí que algo nuevo iba a pasar, algo bueno iba a pasar para los campesinos, algo que iba a cambiarnos a nosotros, la vida de nosotros, y personalmente mi vida también.
And they were so angry that the Teamsters had come in and signed these rotten contracts, giving them about a nickel an hour raise over 5 years, that they were just chomping at the bit to take action.
No hay ningún Quirón trabajando aquí, ningún fin que no lo puedan sacar ustedes. Si de ahorita se comprometen de que mañana van a dar una cuadrilla, no van a soltar hasta que no la saquen.
We looked at him like he was almost like God, just like we'd do anything. It was like, we'd go out to fields or there's, maybe some growers and they were armed with guns or rifles, and that didn't bother us. We felt like, he was a man that instilled a lot of courage.
Los sedientos de justicia hallan en Jesús perdón. Acudamos jubilosos a
what we have to realize, that more than a union is involved here. Here also in this movement is a spirit, the spirit of a people who want to be free.
The Catholic Church, in my view, well, they had missed that whole phase of the civil rights movement, and they weren't going to miss this new Chicano movement that was occurring, and so they jumped in. The Mahoneys and so forth jumped in to get their place on the placard.
The Teamsters put a lot of pressure on, and I'd have to say, sadly, kind of lived up to the Teamsters' image of that period in history. We saw a lot of brutality and violence and things happening.
On the second day of the strike, Jerry Cohen went to the Hanson Ranch to make sure that workers staging a sit-in were safe.
And Hanson confronted us and said, this is our property, Hanson's property, get off the property. And my response was, we want to know that the workers that are on your land are safe, and so when they leave, we'll leave. And at that point, Hanson said, get them, boys. And a big guy named Jimmy Plemons, about 6'5", and I think he was over 300, picked me up by my jacket. And I think his intent was simply to just remove us from the property. The next thing I saw was a big fisted glove in the air. He hit me on the jaw. I ended up in the hospital with a concussion for a week, and that's what happened.
When UFWAC threatened the lettuce boycott, Interharvest and Fresh Picked, two of the biggest Salinas growers, quickly signed contracts. The rest of the growers went to court for injunctions to stop the strike and the lettuce boycott. Now UFWAC aimed its boycott at Bud Entel, the biggest grower in the valley. A local judge ordered Chavez to call off the Entel boycott.
There's a section in the injunction that orders us to tell people not to boycott. And Cesar has been thrown in jail until he orders the end of the boycott of Bud Entel lettuce.
Across the street from the jail, farm workers set up a vigil. Their demonstrations were met by counter-demonstrations of grower and Teamster sympathizers.
When Ethel Kennedy was going to come visit Cesar in jail, obviously we knew strictly what it was. It was strictly a political move for the Kennedys' political advancement, in my estimation.
People were reaching in and throwing picket signs at her and trying to hit her with picket signs, grabbing for her hair, spitting at us, and all this sort of thing. We finally got her in to the jail.
I was struck by his spirituality and his reserves of gentleness and tenderness and caring and love. He was amazing, and of course he was very handsome. That didn't hurt. But he was in a padded cell, and I thought, how dare anyone do this to this saint? How could they treat him as like he was a lunatic or a criminal?
So we got to the back door, and the car was waiting for us. And so as Ethel was leaving, she says, Paul, you really throw some weird parties in here in California.
On Christmas Eve, the California Supreme Court ordered Chavez released from jail. The court later ruled that the growers had signed Teamster contracts without consulting their workers, and that UFWAC's strike and boycott were legal.
Viva Chavez!
But the strike hadn't brought the industry under contract. So the Salinas workers headed off to start a national lettuce boycott. The grape growers in Delano and Coachella had watched closely what had gone on in Salinas. In 1973, when the grape contracts expired, most of them signed with the Teamsters.
Salinas in 70 was kind of like, there was like a rising hope. There had been success piled on success and inspired workers to resist. Coachella in 1973 was very difficult. We had had contracts for 3 years.
Grape growers complained that it was impossible to work with the farm workers.
This is the honest-to-gosh truth. On 2 separate occasions, I personally had to go down to the union hiring hall, go into the hiring hall, take it over, and dispatch people. Because it was so disorganized down there, the people didn't know what they were doing.
You had to work with the ranch committee, which were hardcore, arrogant people who were not what you would call rank-and-file workers. They started out rank-and-file, and they gradually became union pros who were anti-grower and had more of the attitude of the hierarchy of the United Farm Workers.
Workers refused to accept the Teamster contracts that had been negotiated without their consent and walked out of the fields.
Así es que, compañeros, piénsenlo bien, porque saben, porque miren, compañeros, ahí si se quedan ustedes donde están trabajando con la compañía, no van a lograr nada.
No quieran ustedes aceptar una unión de rancheros que ustedes no quieran. Con nosotros, vénganse.
Vénganse, ustedes saben que es una causa justa.
I'm Lloyd Sachem, sir.
I don't give a goddamn who you are. I know who you are.
Congressman Roy Ball.
I know who you are, Reverend Sachem. I'll thank you if you get the hell out of my field, believe me.
Will you give them an election?
They didn't want an election before. Why do they want an election now? Cesar never gave them an election. Like I said, I'm not trying to run a game.
About 30 minutes ago, Lieutenant Yaxmer came over from the Sheriff's Department and asked everyone to move over to this side of the street, saying there'd be no problems if we did. And then around 10 minutes ago, he came back and decided that there was also an injunction on this side of the street, so we have to be 60 feet from that property line, 60 feet from this property line, which puts us somewhere up in the air. For all intents and purposes, we have no right to picket.
You know, if we don't have an election, we're going to be here for 10 years. You're not going to be here 10 years. 30 years, 5 years. We're not going to go. Now, we have an election today at 10 o'clock in the morning. By 1 minute for 10, we get out of here. You can have all of them. You can have all these guys who are workers, part of the Teamsters. We win the election, you guys take off.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
How's that?
Okay, that's all we want. Look, would you agree that there's a strike going on now? Okay, then would you agree then in that case you're breaking a strike?
We're not breaking anything.
Whose side are you on? My side, what do you mean?
Employer's side.
The council voted in the next 3 months to give Mr. Chavez $1,600,000 to try to help him conduct an effective strike against the most vicious, strike-breaking, union-busting effort that I've seen in my lifetime on the part of the team.
We're not really afraid of them. Because to them, if they lose in Coachella, they won't lose anything because they still have a union. To us, if we were to lose in Coachella, that would be the end of a movement and of our union. And we can't afford to do that.
All the Catholics, you're supporting the Communist Party. All the Catholics. Come on, you belong to me. I've been the guy. I've been the guy. You come back at noon. You show you where you belong. You lousy bum. You lousy
And we fought the Teamsters, the most powerful union in the world. Huh? And they brought in their muscle, they brought in their money, they brought in their goons.
We don't need clubs. We don't need clubs, man. We just need people, that's all. Chavez, go! Chavez, go! Chavez, go! Chavez, go! Chavez, go! Chavez, go!
Who do we want in Russia? Who do you got in China?
This man
came at us with a knife. He got a big stick, you know, bigger than my neck, and hit me across the head 3 times.
The work before you is very clear. We want you to take out everybody in those fields. Wherever possible, let's make sure that the grapes turn into raisins on the vines. Let's make sure that in the boycott, if the growers sell the grapes, make sure that the grapes are sold for less money than what it costs them to pick them.
Ese día uno de los días más duros, porque había mucha presión, muchos bases del sheriff, mucha policía. Me agarró por atrás de mis manos y me gritaba que me callara, me decía muchas cosas que yo no entendía muy bien, que yo en ese tiempo no hablaba casi nada de inglés, no entendía suficiente. Y nos forzaron ahí, ¿ve? Nos hicieron violencia contra nosotros.
From June through August, as the strikes moved north, the violence escalated. County sheriffs arrested hundreds, and then thousands of strikers and supporters.
About 1:15 on August 14th, Naji Daifullah, an Arab member of our union, was killed, and then 2 officers dragged him on the ground and left him. All summer long, the police have used excessive force. They've beaten women over the heads, and then they've lied to the press and said that the women have attacked them. They've beaten young children over the heads, and they said that the young children have attacked them, and now they've killed one of our Arab brothers.
Allahu Akbar! Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
We're not afraid. If this is what it takes to build a union, a free and democratic union, and a good union for good people, we're willing to do it. As long as there's 1 ounce of strength in our body, that ounce of strength will be used to fight for this good cause. And in the end, we will win.
2 days after Naji Daifullah's death, a second killing. 60-year-old Juan de la Cruz shot on a picket line.
After people started to get killed, there was a visible change in Cesar. He felt personally responsible. I mean that in every sense of the word, personally responsible for the life and death of people in the Union. And he didn't feel that it was worth it.
They would go to any length to discourage us from keep organizing, even as far as killing people and so forth. So we just had to make a decision: do we quit now or do we continue? We continued because that's what the people wanted.
By the end of 1973, the farm workers had lost 90% of their grape contracts. And there was nothing left of the $1.6 million strike fund from the AFL-CIO. There were few options left. In 1974, they supported Democrat Jerry Brown's bid for governor of California. In return, they expected his support in passing a farm labor law.
Well, after he becomes governor, there was silence. We didn't hear from our friend Jerry. This is a guy who used to come around and profess interest in what we were doing.
They were from a battle. They were from the fields. They were from the boycott all over the country. And they were from the perspective that nobody's going to give the farm workers anything. They have to create the environment by which it comes to them, so they were pushing me.
Governor Brown responded, bringing all the parties together and brokering an historic agreement.
Today marks a victory, not only for the legislature, not only for the farm workers, but for all the people of California.
The California Agricultural Labor Relations Act was signed into law in May 1975. It gave workers the right to secret ballot elections for the first time.
As a politician, we don't want controversy that divides the constituency. And as a matter of fact, I lost a lot of votes in the farm labor area. I mean, among the farmers, they liked me the first year. After that, I was, Typhoid Mary south of Sacramento.
How does it feel, man?
Great. I think the best thing is you talk to the Arab workers. You know, they're very strong, and the Chicano workers on the ranch, I think they're the one. They deserve the credit. They know what union they want.
I guess I could have cried just as much as I probably went out and said and smiled. I think the relief, and even the workers, you can see it in their eyes. They knew what it meant, and I guess, and the grower, they knew too. He knew that for the first time that they always said that the workers really didn't want us. Well, a 3-1 victory, what could he say?
The results were incredible. There were like 400 representation elections in the first 6 months of that law. And the Teamsters won some elections, but we won a lot more elections. It gave us a foothold.
During those first 4 months of activity within the law, from September through December, early January of that year, in essence, and in hindsight, looking back, I mean, that was the only time that the law really functioned the way that we had hoped that it would ever function. I mean, it was being aggressively enforced. Growers were being prevented from violating the law, and if they did, immediate action was taken so that workers sensed that there was power. There was a power there. There was an enforcement there like they'd never seen before.
But as growers learned to use the law, few of the union's election victories ever resulted in signed contracts. By 1977, the Teamsters had withdrawn from the fields, leaving the UFW unchallenged. When the Teamsters thought about trying again a few years later, they realized that it would be too expensive.
And I said, if you took that 5 million or 9 million and put it in the middle of this floor here and lit it, at least we'd get some heat out of it. You know, we'd get a little warmth maybe. But I think that's exactly what you'll be doing if you go into the farm labor thing.
In 1982, Republican George Deukmejian replaced Jerry Brown as California's governor. The largest contributors to his campaign were growers. One of the first things Governor Deukmejian did was to replace several members of the board that administered the farm labor law.
That particular board has been weighted with appointees that just favor one particular union, and they don't want to see any change. Well, there has to be, again, a balance between the interests of the growers as well as protecting the rights of the employees and the farm workers.
And then when the governor comes in and he automatically takes charge of the situation and declares that he's going to side with the employers, he's going to side with agribusiness against us, then it made it almost impossible to do anything effective within the law.
Well before the political winds in Sacramento turned against them, the UFW had lost momentum.
But it seems to me the focus of any union, if a union's going to survive, is organizing. And you have to organize in the fields, and you have to respond to the needs of the people in the fields. And that's what the union was so great at for all those years. And that, I think, is the lifeblood of any union, because unions that don't organize die. So when the union strayed from its path and began to look inward and stopped organizing, I think that then created the conditions for what you saw in the 80s, which was a relative lack of action.
Cesar's focus had changed, and he defined the union's agenda.
We made him very powerful, and we gave him a lot of power. And we gave him our power. And that's why it became very difficult to change anything and change any direction that he took.
I think we'd all come to rely so much on Cesar and his leadership that we hadn't learned to take as much responsibility for exercising leadership ourselves as we should have. And we certainly didn't allow farm workers in local areas to take the responsibility that they could have and wanted to.
Like people would tell us, Cesar's union. I would say it's not Cesar's union, it's a farm worker union. Cesar is the leader. He tells us, how to go about it, and we get to vote if we agree on it at the conventions. Cesar is not, he doesn't say, you do this. He puts it up to a vote.
The union was in crisis, and so was organized labor across the country.
They are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
When President Reagan fired striking air traffic controllers in 1981, most unions stopped organizing and struggled to hold on to what they had.
The 1980s was extremely difficult for labor in general, not only for the United Farm Workers, but we were in particular hit because of the fact that we were such a small operation to begin with.
By the early 1980s, most of the union's original leadership had left, and Chavez was working with a new generation of organizers who shared his new vision. Pesticides had always been a major health issue for farm workers. Now the boycott would focus on the danger to consumers as well as to workers.
We need to get the word out. And to get the word out, we decided the best way to get it out is two ways. One is you get it out through the media, and second, you get it out through what we call direct marketing. That is direct mail, newspaper, radio, and TV ads. That's to get it out. That gets it out a lot faster than picket lines.
Eventually, you'll meet at least one or two of your heroes. Today, I get to talk to Cesar Chavez, and I'm delighted to have him here.
This would be a high-tech boycott. Instead of picket lines in front of supermarkets, the union turned to direct mail. Critics charged that this was a good way to raise money, but not effective in convincing people to change their shopping habits.
And so people thought, well, he should be running around the fields with a flag in his hand, right? We had elections covering 7,000 workers between 89 and 91. And we beat the Teamsters and the painters in about 5 or 6 other elections. So all of this was going on that people weren't aware of because we got no press. We didn't get the election certified. And so people thought that Cesar wasn't organizing.
We'll just go on forever and ever until it's won. How soon it's going to be won, we don't know. We like it to happen tomorrow, but if it doesn't, we'll be here tomorrow and day after and day after and day after and day after and day after. There's nothing else to do. We have nothing else to do but to fight for those things that we've got to correct.
The 1980s brought other setbacks. Throughout the decade, there was practically no enforcement of the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. More and more children were back working in the fields. Wages dropped and living conditions resembled those of the 1930s. And the workforce itself was changing dramatically. Most of the new faces in the fields were undocumented and knew little of Chavez and the UFW. In 1988, Cesar began a fast for life to try to re-energize the movement as he had done before. He was now 61 years old.
You had the feeling he wouldn't be around long enough to continue the fight, that he was giving his life so that others could have a better life. And, it's tough to see.
Jesse Jackson comes, the Kennedys come. It's like this huge public support for Cesar fasting and for the great boycott, and the growers don't call. There was a growing realization that maybe this great boycott wasn't gonna work.
Oh, Esther!
Over the years, many who had worked with the union had drifted apart. With the death of Fred Ross in 1992, hundreds of current and former union activists came together to honor him. Cesar was fighting off laryngitis and a bad cold as he recalled with affection the man who had been his mentor.
The thing I liked most about Fred was there was no bullshit with him. No pretensions, no ego trips, just plain hard work. We would often get impatient, and Fred would say, calma, calma, it'll come, just keep working. Have patience, it'll come.
As in the beginning, it was a time for patience. Over the next few months, Cesar spent much of his time in court. Bruce Church Incorporated had won a $5.4 million judgment against the union for the lettuce boycott. In April 1993, Cesar traveled to San Luis, Arizona to testify in an appeal. He was just a few miles from the place where he was born.
As I look back at it and I think about those few moments that we had on the phone together, I mean, he really said, I'm very tired, Art. I'm very tired. And so then the next day, we left early in the morning with some supporters, and we were driving from Phoenix, Arizona to San Luis to meet him there that particular day. And Jose and I were talking in the car, and we had Radio Campesino on the air because of our station in Phoenix. And as we were listening to it, all of a sudden, I heard some real sad music come out on the radio. And we had the radio turned down kind of low because we were talking to one another. And I asked him to turn it up right away. And I kind of caught, and he caught something to say that Cesar was sick. And so we listened, and we sped up to go even faster because we were in the middle of the desert at that point, and we weren't near any phones. And so Jose started driving as fast as he could, and so we get to a phone, and then the next thing that we heard on the radio, after there was a short interruption in the music, that he had died.
Of course, Cesar and I would fight about almost everything. Sometimes I used to tell Cesar, you like to fight with me because you know that you can get away with it, right? You know what I mean? And you know that I'm still here. Because sometimes he would just fight just to fight. And but those 6 weeks before he passed away, you know, we didn't have a single fight. But yeah, I had even told Richard before, I said, you know, it looks like Cesar's preparing for his mortality.
He had taken us by the hand and show us how to walk in the jungle and not be afraid. He had taught us to maintain dignity by acting like a first-class citizen, because you are a first-class citizen, he said.
He always asked me when he died, he wanted me to build his coffin. And I used to kid him. I said, Cesar, come on, Cesar, you know, Cesar, I'll never outlive you, you know. Because when I die, I want you to build my coffin. I want you to make it out of pine. He told me what kind of wood and everything. And that came to my mind right away. Oh my God, this is his promise, you know. So I built his coffin.
Everyone who came into the union, even if it was for 3 months, or if it was for 15 or 18 years, everyone who came through the union continues to do work in the spirit of the work that we did in the union.
We're not gonna let it die. We're gonna fight for our union as long. I'm old now, and I'll fight till the last.
Major funding for this program was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Additional funding was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the San Francisco Foundation, the California Wellness Foundation, the California Council for the Humanities, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the following funders.
Schools, libraries, and community groups can purchase a video cassette of the Fight in the Fields by calling 800-903-7804 or by writing the address on your screen.